Alira, Triton, and Arbon seemed like ordinary people living ordinary lives, but behind closed doors, they were masterminds of a shadowy empire, trafficking innocent lives across Europe. What began as quiet deception would grow into a network so powerful, so ruthless, that entire cities were touched by its hidden horrors. This is the story of broken lives. In the early 1990s, Albania was a country in transition, shaking off decades of isolation and strict control. Borders that had once been sealed for decades opened almost overnight, and with that opening came a flood of opportunities and dangers. People were eager to escape poverty, to find work, or to build a better life for their families. Small groups of men and women began forming around transport hubs, night businesses, and small trade routes. At first, these groups dealt with minor criminal activities, smuggling goods, forging documents, or running small illegal businesses. But as borders became easier to cross, and oversight remained weak, some began to see a darker possibility. Women became the most vulnerable. They were promised jobs, education, or even marriages abroad. Many left home with hope in their hearts, unaware of the dangers that awaited them. The traffickers treated them as commodities, packing them into cars, buses, and sometimes even hidden compartments in trucks, moving them across borders with remarkable efficiency. Initially, these operations were small, hidden from public view, but they were organized with precision. What started as opportunistic crime evolved quickly into a structured network with clear rules and hierarchies. The leaders of these networks were careful and strategic. They studied routes where police presence was light and borders were poorly monitored. They learned which cities had the highest demand, the easiest escape routes, and the weakest laws to exploit. Apartments were rented in residential areas to operate quietly, and ordinary businesses such as travel agencies, nightclubs, or small hotels served as fronts for the criminal operations. This blend of legality and secrecy made the networks hard to detect. Each successful delivery, each undetected transfer, strengthened their confidence and expanded their reach. Money became the driving force behind the growth of the networks. Payments flowed through layers of intermediaries and shell companies, leaving minimal traces. Meanwhile, leaders remained in the shadows, insulated by layers of secrecy and loyalty. Even those working in the lower ranks were taught to keep quiet, often through fear or intimidation. This early stage of development was critical. It laid the foundation for the vast networks that would later operate across Europe. At the same time, ordinary life continued around these networks. Streets were busy, markets crowded, and families tried to survive. Yet behind this ordinary facade, lives were quietly being destroyed. Victims were often isolated, without resources, and unaware of the dangers until it was too late. The traffickers understood that invisibility was their greatest asset. They moved silently, leaving no immediate traces, while each transfer and arrangement reinforced their system. By the end of this period, the networks were no longer just small groups of opportunistic criminals. They had transformed into organized operations with long-term planning and a clear hierarchy. The quiet beginnings that seemed almost invisible to the public were, in fact, the first steps toward a sprawling and devastating system that would exploit countless lives. The seemingly ordinary streets and open borders of early 1990s Albania were unknowingly the stage for a crime empire that would grow in the shadows, preying on hope and turning dreams of a better life into nightmares. This was a world where ambition and desperation collided, where borders and bureaucracy could be manipulated, and where human lives became the most valuable commodity. What started quietly would eventually ripple outward, affecting cities and countries far beyond Albania, leaving a trail of pain, fear, and broken lives in its wake. As the networks grew, their reach spread far beyond the borders of Albania. The traffickers quickly realized that controlling movement was only the first step. Establishing a system that could operate across multiple countries was where real power and profit lay. They mapped cities across Europe, identifying places where law enforcement was thin, regulations were inconsistent, or corruption could be exploited. Some cities were chosen for their bustling tourist areas, others for industrial districts where temporary laborers were common and missing persons could easily go unnoticed. Every route, every apartment, and every contact was carefully selected to ensure the network could operate smoothly and remain invisible. Operations became increasingly sophisticated. What had once been crowded streets and makeshift arrangements moved into private apartments and rented houses, places where surveillance was almost impossible. Travel agencies, taxi services, and small hotels acted as fronts for the network, creating a sense of legitimacy that kept outsiders from suspecting the truth. Transportation methods became more discreet cars with hidden compartments, buses with carefully timed schedules, and even legitimate shipments of goods used as cover for moving victims. Each city the networks entered became a node in a complex system, linked by trusted couriers, false documentation, and coded communication. Money flowed seamlessly through the network. The traffickers understood that finances were both a shield and a tool. Shell companies were created to launder profits, bank accounts were opened under false identities, and transactions were structured to avoid detection. Even lower-level operatives, who risked their freedom to carry out deliveries, rarely saw the full scale of the money that changed hands. The leadership remained insulated, often operating from safe locations in another country, communicating only through encrypted messages and trusted intermediaries. Every step was calculated to protect them from law enforcement, while simultaneously expanding their reach. Despite the careful planning, the networks thrived because of their ability to adapt. When authorities increased scrutiny in one city, operations quietly shifted to another. If a transport route became risky, a new path was found, sometimes crossing less monitored borders or using alternative modes of travel. This flexibility, combined with meticulous planning, allowed the networks to grow without attracting widespread attention. The traffickers understood the importance of blending in. Luxury cars parked beside modest homes, expensive jewelry worn under plain clothes, all designed to mask the reality of their business. The human cost, however, grew with each expansion. Victims were moved further from home, isolated from family and support systems, and forced to comply under constant surveillance and threats. They became invisible to society, lost in a network that treated them as property. Each new city added another layer of complexity to their control, making escape more difficult and hope harder to hold on to. What began as small, opportunistic crime had now become an organized machine, one that depended on precision, secrecy, and fear to operate. By the end of this period, the networks were no longer confined to Albania. They had become a European problem, with tentacles reaching into multiple countries. Their success was built on strategic planning, secrecy, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities, both in the victims and in the systems meant to protect them. The web had grown wider, more intricate, and more dangerous, setting the stage for a future in which the line between ordinary life and hidden horror would become increasingly blurred. The quiet beginnings had transformed into a sprawling system capable of touching countless lives, leaving devastation in its wake, even as the leaders remained comfortably unseen. The victims of these networks were rarely aware of the danger until it was too late. The traffickers were experts at manipulating trust and exploiting hope. Many young women left Albania with dreams of education, employment, or even marriage abroad. Promises were carefully crafted to appeal to their ambitions or the needs of their families. Some were approached through friends, distant relatives, or strangers who appeared trustworthy, offering opportunities that seemed legitimate. These offers were often presented as life-changing chances, a way to escape poverty and build a better future. Once the women agreed to leave, the trap was set in motion. Travel arrangements were made, sometimes through legitimate-appearing agencies, giving victims the sense that they were stepping into a real opportunity. Documents were prepared, flights were booked, and everything appeared normal. But the moment they crossed the border, the reality shifted. Identification papers would disappear, and debt obligations would appear. Some were told they owed thousands of dollars for travel, housing, or protection, binding them into a cycle of control that was impossible to escape. Isolation became a central tool of control. Victims were moved into hidden apartments, often with no way to contact their families. Phones were taken, movements were monitored, and punishments were enforced for those who resisted. Threats were subtle at first, but they grew increasingly severe. The traffickers understood that fear could be more effective than physical violence alone. The sense of being trapped in a foreign country with no one to turn to left the women dependent on their captors, reinforcing a system that was both psychological and practical in its control. What made these networks so dangerous was their ability to erase identities. The victims' pasts, their hopes, and their individuality were stripped away. They were assigned new names, given rules to follow, and forced into roles that left no room for resistance. Every interaction was controlled, every movement observed. The networks thrived in this environment because it created invisibility. The victims were alive but unseen, their lives measured in transactions rather than human experience. The recruitment strategies were not limited to deception alone. Sometimes families were used to lure victims with promises of legitimate work abroad or financial security for the household. Friends or acquaintances who appeared to have successfully migrated added credibility to the offers. The traffickers understood human nature, knowing that hope could override caution, and that trust was a weapon as powerful as any chain. Even when victims recognized the danger, the options for escape were slim. Attempts to flee were met with threats, retaliation, and further isolation. Each new city, each new apartment, was designed to limit connections and prevent outside interference. The network's ability to maintain secrecy and control over multiple victims simultaneously demonstrated their sophistication and ruthlessness. By the end of this stage, it was clear that these crimes were not random acts of cruelty. They were systematic, premeditated, and structured for maximum efficiency. The women who were caught in the system were trapped in a world where hope and fear existed side by side, manipulated to ensure obedience. The broken promises that lured them into this life became the foundation of a powerful network built on human suffering, where the dreams of escape were constantly replaced by the reality of control, isolation, and relentless exploitation. Each life that was broken strengthened the system, creating a cycle that was difficult to disrupt and devastating for those trapped within it. The growth of these networks was not a product of chaos, but of careful planning and meticulous control. What outsiders often saw as random acts of crime was, in reality, a highly organized system designed to maximize efficiency and profit. Each operation was structured like a business, with clear hierarchies, rules, and responsibilities. Leaders oversaw logistics, finances, and enforcement, while lower-level operatives executed tasks with strict adherence to instructions. The organization resembled a corporation in its precision, with human lives treated as commodities to be managed, scheduled, and moved according to demand. Every aspect of the operation was calculated. Victims were assigned quotas and schedules, their movements monitored to ensure compliance. Housing was organized to minimize risk and maintain secrecy, with rotations between apartments, safe houses, and temporary workplaces to prevent detection. Some operatives were tasked solely with surveillance, ensuring that victims followed instructions, while others managed documentation, finances, and transport. The networks functioned on discipline, and even minor mistakes were met with swift consequences, designed to enforce obedience and maintain order. Money flowed through the system like blood through a body. Payments were collected from clients, laundered through shell companies, and reinvested in expanding operations. The leaders understood that the survival of the network depended on both secrecy and liquidity. Every transaction was structured to minimize traces and prevent authorities from connecting the dots. Even when operations moved across borders, financial strategies were employed to maintain invisibility. Money was the lifeblood that allowed these networks to grow, reinforcing both control and power. Corruption played a critical role in maintaining the system. Local officials, border personnel, and law enforcement were often bribed or intimidated, creating a shield of protection. The traffickers understood that influence, just as much as fear, could maintain the integrity of their operations. With key individuals in positions of authority, either complicit or neutralized, the networks could operate with remarkable freedom. Borders, checkpoints, and even city neighborhoods became passages rather than obstacles, and suspicion rarely fell on those running the system. The illusion of normalcy was central to the network's survival. Luxury cars parked beside modest homes, expensive clothing mixed with ordinary fashion, and social appearances were carefully curated to mask the truth. From the outside, leaders and operatives could appear as ordinary business people or professionals, blending into the environment while continuing their criminal activities. Even family life was sometimes maintained as a cover, further reducing suspicion. This blending of legality and crime created an almost impenetrable facade, hiding the scale and brutality of the operations from public view. While the network expanded, the human cost became more severe. Victims endured long hours of work, constant surveillance, and threats that eroded their autonomy. Physical and psychological control were maintained simultaneously, ensuring that compliance was not optional. The system was built to break resistance before it could grow, leaving survivors with the memory of their confinement and exploitation long after their escape. By the end of this period, the network had become a highly sophisticated, corporate-like machine. Every element, from logistics to finances, was carefully managed, and human lives were subordinated to the goals of profit and control. The operations were no longer opportunistic, they were deliberate, methodical, and ruthlessly efficient. The scale and organization of the network revealed a disturbing truth. The crime was not only in the acts themselves, but in the system that allowed them to grow, expand, and operate almost invisibly, leaving destruction and broken lives in its wake. Even the most carefully constructed systems eventually show signs of weakness, and by the mid-2000s, cracks began to appear in the Albanian networks. For years, they had operated with near impunity, moving victims, money, and influence across borders with astonishing efficiency. But as their operations expanded, the scope of their activity left traces that could no longer be ignored. Banks began to notice unusual patterns of transactions. Charities and social organizations picked up on missing or displaced persons, and survivors who managed to escape began to leave evidence behind. The very tools that had once allowed the networks to flourish, movement, communication, and finance, now became vulnerabilities that law enforcement could exploit. The first warnings were subtle. A bank flagged a suspicious transfer tied to a shell company. A local charity noticed repeated inquiries from families whose daughters had disappeared abroad. A survivor contacted authorities, providing details about travel routes, safe houses, and recruiters. Each of these small incidents alone might have been dismissed, but together they formed a pattern. Investigators in different countries began to collaborate, sharing intelligence and building a picture of a sprawling international criminal system. Slowly, the network's previously invisible threads started to become visible. Pressure on the networks caused panic in their ranks. Leaders adjusted routes, moved safe houses, and shifted operations to avoid scrutiny. Lower-level operatives were instructed to lie, mislead, or destroy evidence. Yet despite these efforts, cracks persisted. Coordinated investigations revealed the complexity of the system, and law enforcement began to understand that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, organized structure. The network's ability to intimidate or bribe officials worked in some areas, but growing international cooperation meant that influence had limits. As scrutiny increased, the networks made mistakes. Transactions meant to be secret were traced. Communication errors exposed relationships between operatives. Survivors provided detailed testimony, revealing hierarchies and methods that investigators had previously only guessed at. What had once been a tightly controlled operation now faced a cascade of exposures. The very sophistication that had allowed the networks to thrive now made them vulnerable to discovery, as the system was so complex that a single breach could unravel it. Despite the mounting pressure, the traffickers continued to act as though they were untouchable. Confidence turned to arrogance, and some leaders underestimated the persistence of investigators. Yet each misstep, each report, and each escape chipped away at the illusion of control. Arrests of minor operatives sent shockwaves through the networks, forcing leaders to make hasty decisions, relocate assets, and reassess strategies. The networks were no longer operating in the shadows without risk. The world was beginning to see them, and consequences were finally catching up. At the same time, the survivors' stories grew louder. As more escaped, authorities had the chance to piece together a clearer picture of the network's methods, routes, and structures. Public awareness increased, putting pressure on governments and communities to respond more effectively. The network's invisibility, once their greatest asset, was rapidly disappearing. By the end of this period, it became clear that the era of unchecked expansion was over. The networks were still dangerous, but their operations were no longer invisible. Investigators had discovered patterns, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The cracks in the system signaled the beginning of a long, challenging process that would eventually lead to exposure, arrests, and the unraveling of the once powerful networks. The quiet confidence that had sustained them for years was beginning to crumble under the weight of evidence, persistence, and the determination of those who refused to remain silent. The leaders of the networks had long believed themselves untouchable. Years of operating in secrecy, moving victims across borders, and laundering money through elaborate schemes had created an illusion of invincibility. They trusted distance, loyalty, and wealth to shield them from consequences. Safe houses in quiet neighborhoods, luxury cars parked alongside ordinary homes, and legitimate-looking businesses gave the appearance of normality, hiding the dark operations from public view. Technology, once a tool for coordination and efficiency, became a double-edged sword, offering the promise of invisibility while leaving traces that could later expose them. For years, encrypted communication and coded messages allowed leaders to direct operations from afar, making arrests of lower-level operatives seem inconsequential. The higher-ups believed that no investigation could reach them, that their careful planning insulated them from discovery. They felt secure in the knowledge that law enforcement agencies in different countries are rarely able to coordinate effectively. Orders, regulations, and language differences were viewed not as obstacles, but as shields. The illusion of power fed arrogance, convincing leaders that their system was flawless and that their empire could continue expanding indefinitely. Yet even the most sophisticated systems contain vulnerabilities. The same tools that had once enabled rapid expansion phones, digital records, and financial transfers gradually became points of exposure. Investigators began to infiltrate communication networks, decode encrypted messages, and follow financial trails. Digital evidence revealed connections between previously unlinked operatives, while travel records exposed patterns of movement that authorities had once assumed random. The systems of secrecy that had protected the leaders now left them exposed, like cracks in a carefully polished facade. The illusion of invincibility began to erode as authorities coordinated across borders. Intelligence sharing became more effective, linking minor arrests and recovered evidence to larger organizational structures. Safe houses, once hidden in plain sight, were identified through surveillance and informants. Operatives under pressure started providing information, whether willingly or under duress, exposing the network's inner workings. Even wealth could not buy absolute protection. Assets were traced, accounts frozen, and shell companies dismantled. The perception that the leaders were untouchable was shattered piece by piece. At the same time, Survivors and witnesses became critical players in dismantling the network. Their testimony provided detailed insights into operations, hierarchies, and methods of control. Each survivor who stepped forward chipped away at the leader's carefully constructed image of invulnerability. Evidence collected over years from flight records, financial documents, and travel logs, combined with personal accounts, created a comprehensive picture of the network's operations. The leaders' overconfidence became their downfall. While they had spent years perfecting control over victims and operatives, they had underestimated the persistence and coordination of investigators. The very systems that allowed them to expand rapidly, technology, communication, and logistics were turned against them. The illusion of power began to collapse as raids, arrests, and seizures demonstrated that no amount of planning could fully protect them from exposure. By the end of this period, it was clear that the networks were no longer beyond reach. The facade of control, carefully maintained for years, was cracking. Leaders who once believed themselves untouchable faced the reality that their operations could be dismantled, their secrets exposed, and their empire destroyed. The collapse of the illusion of power marked a turning point, signaling that even the most hidden and sophisticated criminal networks could be brought into the light, one revelation at a time. The fall of the networks was sudden, brutal, and unavoidable. After years of careful planning, secrecy, and control, the operations that had seemed invincible began to crumble under the weight of coordinated investigations. Law enforcement agencies across multiple countries launched simultaneous operations, targeting safe houses, financial accounts, and key operatives. Borders that had once been exploited became checkpoints where arrests were made, and the network's once hidden activities were exposed to the public for the first time. The years of careful planning and the illusion of invincibility evaporated almost overnight, replaced by chaos and panic within the organization. The arrests were strategic. Lower-level operatives were detained first, creating cracks in the network's structure and sowing distrust among its ranks. Investigators then moved on to mid-level organizers, whose knowledge of routes, finances, and contacts proved invaluable in unraveling the system. Each capture led to more information, with evidence cascading through the legal system like a series of falling dominoes. The once tightly controlled network was now fractured, with leaders scrambling to protect themselves, destroy evidence, and flee jurisdictions. The very hierarchy that had allowed the organization to function efficiently now accelerated its collapse as fear replaced loyalty. Leaders who had long believed they were untouchable were forced to confront reality. Safe houses were raided, luxury cars seized, and bank accounts frozen. Attempts to move money or relocate victims were intercepted, cutting off the resources that had sustained the operations. Some tried to escape to countries with weaker law enforcement, only to be tracked and apprehended. The pressure caused infighting among operatives, as trust disintegrated and loyalty eroded. Alliances that had once been reliable became liabilities, and paranoia spread through the organization. The empire built on fear and control now faced the very same forces it had used to maintain dominance. The public exposure of the networks shocked communities across Europe. Media coverage revealed the scale and brutality of the crimes, and the stories of survivors brought a human face to the statistics. Courtrooms became battlegrounds where evidence collected over years was presented, showing not only the methods of control and exploitation, but also the calculated, systematic nature of the operations. Prosecutors emphasized that these were not isolated incidents or spontaneous criminal acts. They were part of a deliberate, organized, and ruthless system designed to maximize profit at the expense of human lives. For the victims, the arrests were both a relief and a reminder of the trauma they had endured. Many faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives, navigating psychological scars, legal proceedings, and the stigma attached to their experiences. Support networks, NGOs, and social services mobilized to help survivors recover, though the damage inflicted by years of control and abuse could not be erased entirely. Each testimony, however, contributed to dismantling the networks and ensuring that those responsible were held accountable. By the end of this period, the networks that had once seemed untouchable were dismantled, their leaders imprisoned, their assets seized, and their operations destroyed. The fall demonstrated the power of persistence, cooperation, and evidence-based investigation. What had been a sprawling, sophisticated, and secretive system of exploitation was now a case study in the consequences of arrogance and overconfidence. The collapse of the networks proved that even the most carefully concealed criminal enterprises could be brought to justice when determination, coordination, and vigilance combined to challenge their power. Even after the arrests and the dismantling of the networks, the impact on survivors and communities was far from over. The physical liberation of victims did not erase years of exploitation, fear, and trauma. Many survivors returned to countries where they had few resources, families struggling with poverty, or communities that offered little understanding of the horrors they had endured. The process of recovery was long and complex, requiring both psychological and practical support. Counseling, safe housing, legal assistance, and medical care became essential. Yet even with these resources, rebuilding a life fractured by years of control was a monumental challenge. The survivors' journeys highlighted the human cost of the network's operations. Every story was marked by isolation, manipulation, and fear, and yet each also demonstrated resilience. Some learned to navigate legal systems to reclaim freedom and security, while others dedicated themselves to helping those still at risk. NGOs and social services stepped in to provide education, job training, and emotional support, helping survivors regain a sense of independence. Communities, once unaware of the network's presence, began to recognize the warning signs and offer support to those at risk, creating protective systems that had been absent during the network's rise. The fall of the networks also reshaped law enforcement strategies across Europe. Governments and agencies analyzed how the networks had exploited gaps in border security, communication, and financial oversight. Coordinated task forces were established, intelligence sharing agreements improved, and new technologies were deployed to track suspicious activity. Training programs for officers were updated to identify and respond to human trafficking, while victim-centered approaches became more common. The network's exposure prompted policymakers to strengthen legislation and increase penalties for trafficking and exploitation, reflecting a growing awareness of the scale and severity of the crimes. Despite these efforts, the shadow of the networks lingered. The systems of abuse had existed for years, and their disruption did not immediately erase the demand or vulnerabilities that had allowed them to thrive. Some smaller groups attempted to fill the void left behind, highlighting the ongoing need for vigilance, education, and support. Survivors, law enforcement, and communities remained on alert, aware that the end of one network did not guarantee the end of exploitation. The fight against trafficking became both preventative and reactive, combining legal action with awareness campaigns and community-based interventions. At the same time, the survivors' stories became powerful tools for change. Their testimonies, shared publicly or through legal proceedings, revealed the true extent of the network's cruelty and sophistication. These accounts humanized statistics, showing the psychological, social, and physical damage inflicted by years of control. By speaking out, survivors not only helped bring perpetrators to justice, but also educated communities and authorities, reducing the likelihood that future victims would be taken unaware. Their courage transformed them into advocates reshaping public understanding of human trafficking and creating networks of support that were once absent by the end of this chapter. It was clear that the story of the Albanian sex crime networks was not simply one of arrest and closure. It was a story of endurance, resilience, and systemic change. While lives had been broken, the exposure of the networks catalyzed awareness, reforms, and protections that would continue to save and protect lives in the years to come. The survivors' struggle became a symbol of vigilance and recovery, showing that even in the aftermath of extreme exploitation, the human spirit could rebuild, resist, and shine light on the darkest corners of hidden crime.